Hey, today I want to start off with asking you a simple but a little tricky question. And the question is this: do you own your stuff, or does your stuff own you? Now, at first thought, you're thinking, of course I own my stuff. My stuff doesn't own me. I mean, I'm the one that spends my money the way I think it should be spent. I'm the one that turns on and off my phone. I'm the one that controls what happens in my house. Yeah, that sounds like I own my stuff, that I control my stuff. Now today we're going to be looking at a passage where Jesus would challenge that thinking and even show the dangers of thinking that way. So let's take a look at Luke chapter 16. We're going to be starting from verse 10. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? Now, at first reading, it sounds like what Jesus is saying is, if you do a good job with the little things that you have right now, later on in your life, you're going to be given a lot more. And if you have not been good with the things that you have right now, then God's going to take it away in the future. Now, that's what it sounds like, but you and I probably know people who have had very little, and they're really good with the little things that they have, but they're still without a lot of things. God hasn't given them a lot of things. And that's because that's not what that verse is saying. In order to find out what Jesus is saying here, we have to look at his context. So let's go back to Luke chapter 14 to do a little review. In Luke chapter 14, Jesus is hanging out with a bunch of rich people. And Jesus makes a claim that these people made their wealth, well, because God gave it to them. And Jesus makes it clear that these people have that wealth so that they could go and help and bless the people around them who don't have that wealth. But instead, they were using that wealth to set themselves apart from everybody else. So being angry with that, Jesus leaves the party, and then he starts to hang out with the people who were poor, the people who were outcasts. These religious people, these rich people, they follow him outside. Jesus turns to them and tells them 3 parables, 3 stories, to let them know that because they set themselves apart from the world so much that they can't even celebrate when lost people are found. Now we're looking at today's passage, the one that I just read to you. In its context, what Jesus is saying is, you religious people, you're letting your things, your love for your things, make decisions for you. And maybe you can relate to this. Maybe recently you got a brand new car and the inside is beautiful. Leather, it's clean, things are shiny, there's no dust. And then you go to pick somebody up and you realize that person wears really, really dirty jeans. And now you have to think twice about letting that person in your car. You see, now your stuff is now helping you decide who you let in your car. In other words, you don't own your car is owning you. In the same way, Jesus is telling the religious people, your wealth has now set you apart from the world. You are no longer making decisions with your heart, you're making decisions based off the things that you have. And Jesus is telling them, be careful, because the things you have right now in your position is causing you to stumble. So that's the problem. Your stuff is controlling you instead of the other way around. But then Jesus peels that layer and reveals that there's something else underneath it. And underneath that layer is Jesus saying, you know what the problem is? You think these things actually belong to you, when in reality, they're actually God's stuff that's been entrusted to you. So now Jesus is saying, the problem here is that you started to believe that these possessions were actually yours, and therefore you're doing with it what you think you should be doing with it. Whereas, if you believe that this stuff actually belongs to God, you should be asking God what you should be doing with this. So let's go back to that car illustration. When you pick up somebody in your nice new car, you have to ask, God, do you want me to pick up that person, making the inside of this car a little dirtier? And if God says, yeah, I think people are more important than your car, then you shouldn't care how dirty your car gets, because it's not yours, it's actually God's. So Jesus is pointing out that danger, the danger of thinking that you own your stuff, when in reality, your stuff is actually controlling you. Let's read on. Verse 13. No one can serve 2 masters. So Jesus is saying, we've already established that you don't really own your stuff, that your stuff is actually owning you. It seems that every human being has to have a master. For you religious people, it's your stuff. Your stuff is your master. For everybody else, God would say, I would wish that I am your master. So now you have to choose. Am I going to let my stuff control me, or am I going to let God control me? So let's read on. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Now, when the Pharisees heard this, they were angry because they knew deep down in their hearts that Jesus was right. And you can see that in the very next verse. It says this, the Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. Now, the Greek word there for sneering literally means blowing their nose at Jesus. This is their culture's way of saying they wanted to discredit Jesus so bad at this point because they knew he was right. And then Jesus says this, he says, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight. Jesus basically says, you know you're living a lie. You know that the things you have don't really belong to you. You know that your stuff is controlling you. You claim that you love God, but you really don't. You love your stuff more than you love God. And you want to make yourself think otherwise so badly that you started teaching the people around you that you are actually loving God more than money. So now the people around you are telling you that you love God more than money, but deep down inside, you know it's a lie, right? Then Jesus starts talking about something that might be a little hard to understand. So we'll break it down so we all understand what he's really trying to say here. So let's look at verse 16. The laws and the prophets were proclaimed until John. John is referring to John the Baptist. The laws and prophets is referring to Old Testament. So in other words, he's saying the Old Testament was proclaimed until John the Baptist showed up. So what does that mean? He's saying everything that these religious people understand is based off the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, if you did something good, then you were blessed for it. If you did something bad, you were cursed for it. And he says that teaching stops as of 3 years ago when John the Baptist first showed up on the scene. And then the next line says, since that time, the good news of the kingdom of God is being preached and everyone is forcing their way into it. Another way of saying this is, as of 3 years ago, when John the Baptist showed up on the scene, which is also when Jesus showed up on the scene, there's a new message that's being preached. And this new message allows for people who were once excluded to come in. So if you're poor, welcome to the kingdom of God. If you had a disease, welcome to the kingdom of God. You're a different race, welcome to the kingdom of God. So now everybody is saying, wow, we have to be a part of it. We can't wait to be a part of it. Let's rush in. Then he says this, it is easier for heaven and earth to disappear than for the least stroke of a pen to drop out of the law. This is Jesus' way of saying, if you think that I'm compromising on the Old Testament, I am not. As a matter of fact, after I'm done with my ministry, go ahead and read the Old Testament again. You're going to find out that everything I'm doing and everything I'm saying were actually hinted in the Old Testament. It's actually very consistent with what is written in the Bible. So what Jesus is saying is this, you religious people, you rich people, if you think that you are rich because God is somehow blessing you because you did something right, it's like that way of thinking is now over. Now, the very next line is very confusing. It's like a curveball, and it seems like Jesus was distracted by something, but it makes complete sense in its narrative, so let's take a look at it. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery, and the man who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Yeah, that was weird, right? Now, why is Jesus talking about marriage all of a sudden? Now, if you think this is a verse about how we should not divorce people and we should not get remarried afterwards, that's not the point that Jesus is making in this verse right here. So in order to make sense of what Jesus is trying to say here, we have to look at his context. Now, while God really loved the idea of marriage, he also created a system in which women could benefit in society through marriage. Because back then, women had no rights. And so for that woman to survive in society, she had to be connected to a man. So back in those days, when women got married, there was such a sigh of relief from the parents because they knew, oh, our daughter is going to be okay now. But what about the husband? What if he, after being married, sees another woman and lusts after that woman, and he wants to be with her instead of the one that he just married? You see, the Old Testament does not allow men to have affairs just because they're attracted to somebody else. So these rich people and these religious people, they will scour through the scriptures looking for verses on how they could chase after their lust without breaking any commands. And they found it in the book of Deuteronomy. There it says you could divorce your wife if she did anything detestable. And who defines what detestable is? Well, they defined it for themselves. They said, well, if my wife cooks me burnt toast, then that's detestable to me, and so I'm going to divorce my wife. So these religious people, these rich men, were able to chase after the lust of their hearts and at the same time not break any commands. And this is precisely why Jesus brought this up at the end of that talk. You see, both in the case of their wives and with money, they were able to do these things where they weren't breaking any commands in the Bible, but at the same time they were accomplishing the exact opposite of what God intended them to do. So for example, with their wives, God had them marry these women so that they will not be abandoned in society. But without breaking any commands in the Bible, these women are now left out to dry, while these people chased after their new wives. And in the same way, they were able to use their money without breaking a single command in the Bible. But at the same time, the people outside, the people who are cast out, the people who are lost but are not found, they're still out there left to dry. And Jesus says, that's not going to fly anymore. And so Jesus says, you followed all the commands in the Bible, but you missed the heart of the commands. The heart of the command is regardless of your gender, regardless of your background, regardless of what race you are, regardless of your socioeconomic status, regardless of your sexual orientation, regardless of how much money you have in your pockets right now, regardless of whether if you're sick or you're healthy, regardless of the worst crime that you've committed in your life, regardless of all of that, stop looking at them by labels. Start looking at them as people who are image bearers of God. And the religious people fail to do that. You see, Jesus is saying to these religious people, God is not your master anymore. Money is. And because money is the thing that you worship more than God, you can no longer see the image of God in humanity. Now, I want to share a story with you that took place about 15 to 20 years ago. And this story involves two guys who attend our church today. And I haven't asked them permission if I could share this story, but I think it's okay to share this story. So back then I was doing youth ministry. I took care of the youth. And to get to know the youth, you would drive them everywhere. If they want to go miniature golfing, you drive them there and get to know them there. And around that time, I also bought a new car. It was a small Corolla, that's all I could afford. So one day they were invited to a Super Bowl party, so I picked them up from their house and then drove them there and then hung out with them. And their parents basically told them, make sure they're home by a certain time. So when that time came, I told the boys, hey, let's get in the car, let's go home. Now, these boys at the time were probably in junior high. And so as they were running towards my car, they called shotgun. And the other one, forgetting to call shotgun, thought, no, if I get there first, I could probably get shotgun. So they were both running towards my car. And one of them thought it would be so much faster if I just jumped over the hood of the car, slid across it, and get to the other side first. Well, I guess this person thought he was better at jumping than he actually was, because he tried to jump over my car, but instead hit the side of the car, dented it, and fell to the ground. So the side of my car had this big V-shaped dent in it. Now, when the car got dented, I was more worried about the boy who was on the ground. I was like, are you okay? But then, was I angry about the car? I was disappointed, but I wasn't angry about it. So after I dropped off the boys at their respective homes, I called my friend and asked them, how do you pull out a dent? How do you fix a car once it's been dented? And after he explained to me how he would go about it, he asked me this question. He said, are you going to let those boys near your car ever again? And I was surprised at that question because it never crossed my mind. I never thought about it that way. Now let's fast forward a few months. Those same two boys are in the back seat. And as we're driving, I start hearing them play fight. It turns out one of them has a Sharpie and he's trying to draw on the other person's hand or face or something like that. So the other person grabs his hand to make sure it doesn't get near his face. And as they're struggling, the hand gets pushed over and then that marker draws a straight line in the back of my passenger seat. And the first thought that went through my mind wasn't, oh no, my car. No, the first thought that went through my mind is, well, God, if this is what you want me to do with this car, then so be it. Now, the reason why I could tell this story with a smile and not have any resentment against these boys, even today, is because early on in my ownership of this car, I told God that I'm not going to let this car own me, that I'm going to let God own me, and that whatever He wants me to do with His car, that I would do it wholeheartedly. But now the bottom line of this message is not that money and stuff makes you evil. What I am saying though is that your love and devotion to your stuff is what compromises you. You see, the very moment you start to believe that you own your stuff is when your stuff starts to own you. You see, Jesus is warning us, don't let your stuff own you. He's telling us to remind ourselves constantly that the things that are in our possessions are actually things that God has entrusted us to use to bring more heaven on earth. In other words, on a daily basis, we should be asking, God, what do you want us to do with your things today? So, brothers and sisters, may God have full lordship over you, your life, and your things. And may you use your things to bring more heaven on earth than to bring division between you and the people around you. And through all those things, may we all experience heaven together. God bless you.